So welcome to the Greenhouse Talk. I'll be your host, and I'll be walking you through how I go about using VS Code and Typescript to work on a fairly large TypeScript project that's in a monorepo, and that in this case being Dendron. So to start off, anytime if you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt, and I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so you should see, you should see my window. And right now, what I have open on this side is VS Code, and what I have here is the task that I'll be working on today. And so specifically to go over the details here, Dendron, we have a CLI. In the CLI, you can look up notes. And so what it looks like today is, let me know if the screen size is okay or if it's too small. If it's a little small, I can magnify it. But today, to go over the feature we'll be going over. So Dendron has a CLI. It has a note command that lets you look up notes inside of your workspace. And so, for example, in this case, if we're looking over Dendron,
sorry to interrupt, but you're sharing the wrong screen.
I see. Is it?
You're sharing the Discord screen.
Let me. Ooh. That's interesting. Let me. I think I need to share my window instead of an application. So, give me 1 second. Okay, can you guys see my terminal? Yeah.
No.
How about?
I see the VS Code.
Okay, cool. And then now this is the terminal, right?
Yes.
Okay. So for a little bit of groundwork, we've opened up the Dendron mono repo, and then inside our repo we have something called test workspace, where we have a bunch of notes that go over various Dendron features. This is a quick way for us to debug and test new features. And what we'll be implementing today is adding on the Dendron note lookup CLI command. So the CLI command right now, what it lets you do is it lets you look up a note using the CLI. And so to go over an example, this command here, it's basically performing a lookup with Dendron on Vault 2, and then it gives you the JSON response of the note. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be supporting different output formats for this command. So in addition to outputting JSON, also being able to output Markdown. That's either the GitHub flavored Markdown or the Dendron Markdown. And the first thing you'll notice is that I have this task in a note. The way that I like to map things out is if I'm working on something, I have a template. So to go over the task, this is what I want to do. I like to write the commit message ahead of time just to kind of focus me on this is the outcome that I want to achieve. And then afterwards, I'll break it down into the series of steps I'm going to do. So like write tests, work on Dendron Markdown output, because that'll be the easiest. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to VS Code. I guess most immediate thing to notice, I like to have my code set up in this 4-way split, and there's some extensions I like to use. For TypeScript, or for anything, I would say like Git Lens is something that you should install. It gives you additional capabilities with Git. For example, being able to see line blames and much better history. We also actually sponsor them. But Git Lens is probably the most downloaded extension in VS Code. And then the other one is Prettier, which is live code it's code formatting. And then also Vim. All right. Want to make sure I'm not missing. Hey, Lightbulb. What's going on is that I'm doing a coding session, so I'm adding a feature in Dendron and walking through my process for doing it. All right. So I actually laid out a little bit of the things that I wanted to cover today. So walking through the VS Code setup, we talked about the installed extensions, we talked about the layout. One more thing I want to go over is my settings, and I'll make this available afterwards as well. The main thing you'll notice here is for TypeScript, I've set the default formatter to be VS Code. This just makes sure that I don't have to think about tabs or spaces or formatting. The editor can handle that for me. Other things that are notable, that is the main thing. Okay. So now that we've gone over settings, let's go through the code. So when I start the task, I've gone over this in the beginning. I like to make a scratch note and then just write down some of the things that I like to do. And in this case, the way that I work on code inside of VS Code, I have the main thing that I'm working on the top left column. And so in this case, I know that I'll be working, this is the part for the Dendron CLI and specifically the notes command. So let me turn on screencast. I like to clear away all the other tabs, put it back in outline mode. And since this is the main thing I'll be working on, just pinning it. Now before I work on this, so I like to make sure that everything currently passes. And so we have tests for basically all of the components. And what I'll do is I'll run this test watcher that this is just a sanity test to make sure that the thing that I'm working on isn't broken to start off with. And what this does, it tests the current note lookup commands. And so this is doing a lookup when you don't specify a vault, and then deleting a note. Okay. So first, what we want to do now is add a new option to the CLI command. This is part of note lookup. So let's go in here and add a new case. And while I'm doing this, I'm not looking at the Discord, so if there's anything that is pressing, feel free to just say it in the chat. So, lookup note with no vault specified, and output equals markdown. So this is the first thing that we're implementing, which is instead of this JSON output, we actually just want the regular Dendron markdown output that you see when you are looking at the node. So to do that, we need to introduce the option. So here are all the options. We're going to add a new optional option. So node clay output. And these are the three outputs that we'll be taking. And then we'll be adding it to the CLI. It's not going to be an arbitrary string, but we want to make sure that it is one of the supplied output options. There. And for default, to preserve existing behavior, we want to go with JSON. Okay, and so now what you'll notice if we run this command, so this is just Dendron node lookup. Because we didn't enter a query, it's a wrong query, but what we will notice, well, we don't notice anything because here's one of the common mistakes with TypeScript, which I just made, is because TypeScript needs to be compiled, because we weren't compiling the code, it hasn't updated. And so in Dendron, we have a scripts watch. This watches over every single package in the Dendron mono repo and makes sure to compile them as you're working on it. So this means as you change your code is automatically compiled and updated. And so now, if we try this again, what we should notice is a new option added. So here you see output. And then because we gave it choices, you'll notice that it has these three valid choices. Okay. And the cool thing here is also we're using Jest for testing, so these tests also update when you update the code. So right now, this is just telling us that we haven't broken anything yet. This test isn't implemented yet, the Markdown Dendron, so I'm gonna skip this right now. And then for when node lookup with no vault is specified, this is still good. Okay, so now let's focus on this test. When I'm working, I like to have a short feedback cycle. So if by specifying only, we're just making sure that just this test is running. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in an output. And the output here is going to be the Markdown Dendron. But before I can use it in my test, I need to export it. This is a quirk of how the Dendron testing suite is set up. So the way that we have everything, instead of having tests in each individual package, we have one test package called engine test. And this engine test imports everything and runs all the tests within one package. The reason we do it this way is just because a lot of the test harnesses require utilities from multiple packages. And so centralizing all of this in one test package makes sure that we can reuse logic and makes things a little easier to test. So now I'm going to use node CLI in here. All right. And right now what this test is doing, it's running or node command. So this is just a helper function. It creates a new instance of the node CLI command, and it executes it with the with some default variables and custom options that you pass in. And so right now, this test harness, it sets up a mock workspace for us with some notes, And what we're doing is we're running the node CLI command inside this workspace. And after we run it, we check for the note so in this case, what we were actually doing is we were creating a node. So this node doesn't exist, and because we've looked it up, Dendron created it, and then this is checking that that node has actually been created. We don't actually want to do this in this case because we want to test, can we get the markdown output from this node? So we're going to change this up a little bit. So the run engine test, you'll see this a lot in the testing code. It sets up a workspace, but by default, it's an empty workspace. It has no notes in it. Now, we have some preset tests that you can add, or preset notes you can add using the setup here. So pre-setup hook, this is a hook that lets you add notes into the workspace before it becomes initialized. And so at Dendron, we have some preset ones in engine hooks. This is actually something that if you look at our developer docs, so in our developer docs, we have a reference of what the different hooks initialize you with. So setup basic, it initializes a vault with 3 notes. So foo, child, warn, and bar. And then we also have a setup basic multi hook, which initializes a workspace with 3 vaults. So in this case, we're going to go with the setup basic. And so we know that there is a note called foo in there. So that is what we're going to query for. And the first thing I like to do is, well, get a snapshot of what this gives, returns. So the testing framework we're using is called Jest, and it has this ability to create a snapshot of your test. And what the snapshot is essentially it takes the output and serializes it, and the next time you run the test, it can check if the old snapshot was the same as the current snapshot, so you know if something has changed. And so right now, what you see in the snap file is that we have gotten the JSON output. Which is actually not what we want. We want the markdown output. So now we're actually going to go in and handle how we do markdown. And just stopping in this point to see if anyone has questions. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Something that I like to do, VSCode has breadcrumbs, and they're actually really useful, especially for Typescript where things are well defined. The shortcut to go to breadcrumbs on a Mac is Command-Shift-Dot, but it's just a quick way of navigating within a file. And so in this case, I want to go to execute, and I want to update how we do lookup. So right now, whenever you run lookup inside the CLI, first we're going to check the query, then we're going to get the note, and then we print the note. But let's actually take into account what the output option is. So let's let's define a payload. If the output is JSON, then we do what we currently do. But if we're dealing with Dendron, then instead of just printing out the whole body, we want to serialize a note. So data.note. So what we return from getNoteByPath is a note object, and a note object, if you give this a moment, right now I'm using symbol lookup, Command T. It's useful for finding specific objects. One thing you'll have to be careful about in TypeScript is that TypeScript has the code, but it also generates type definitions. So you'll have a lot of noise when you do this sort of lookup. Look for the file that's defined in source, not lib. But note props, essentially this is what is returned in the JSON. And to get it to the state where we see it as we normally see it inside of Dendron, we want to serialize it. And so this takes note props. So you can see over here, the serialize function, what it does is it takes the properties and then it stringifies it. This is actually what we do when we show you your notes. As when you write a note, we submit JSON to the engine, and then it writes this on disk using the serialize function. You'll notice that there's a red squiggly line here. This is because serialize takes a note, but in this function, getNoteByPath, it could return undefined because the note might not actually exist. And so in this case, ideally, if we were smarter about this, this shouldn't be possible. Because getNoteByPath, we have an option that if we don't find a note, if new is set, then we will create it. But if this is set to false, then you'll get undefined. So what we should do here is actually be more descriptive in our type of this function so that TypeScript can tell if the node is undefined or not. That's one option. Another option is to split this up into two functions. So one is, get or create note, and the other one is get node, where get or create node will always return a node, but get node might not. In today's case, just to save some time as we're doing this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assert that this is not undefined. That's what the exclamation point is for. I'll probably go back later to properly refactor this. In general, we want to avoid assertions if we can, because it goes around the TypeScript type system. But in this case, we're asserting this because we know that we will always return a note because of this option. We just haven't noted this in the type system. Now, speaking of type system, one thing that we do is whenever we use a switch statement with multiple options, we have this code assert unreachable as a default statement. Let me import it first. So assert unreachable, it's actually quite clever. It's something that Khan, one of our team members, implemented, is that it uses the type system to check if we are not handling a case. In this case, we're not handling the GitHub flavored markdown option. It's one of the enums. And the way that this works is that Typescript has, let me go back here. Typescript has a never type. And so, and also this is summarized here, but never essentially means that the compiler should never be able to reach the state. And if it does, then that there is an error. And the compiler can reach the state because we're not handling one of the cases. And so this is a good idiom to use for a switch statement to make sure that you are actually handling all the cases. So now, if we do this, notice how the red squiggly line went away. Right now, because this is not implemented, we're just gonna throw an error. Okay, now we're gonna save this. And we're gonna hit enter, or we're gonna hit save here to make the test run. The reason that the test isn't able to auto run is because this is in a separate package as the test. So sometimes we need to save, well, we will always need to save in the actual test to trigger a new test run. Now, if we look at the snapshot, we'll notice that it hasn't changed, which means that right now we're still not converting to Markdown. And so let's figure out why that is. So over here, we're running a command. What command are we running? We are running the lookup command. We are passing in the output option. And as a sanity check, we are still watching the file. So what's going on? One thing that is useful to do at this point is to drop in a debugger. So this is dropping in the debug statement. And in the test, we have a task called debug. Yes, debug. And when we run this, what's going to happen is it's going to start a debugger and it's going to break at the debug point. And what we want to see is if we're actually passing this output variable along. One thing you'll notice when we're doing debugging is that the output here is actually JavaScript, not TypeScript. This is because this is what VSCode is actually running. So you have to do a little bit of mapping between the JavaScript and the TypeScript, but as you can see, it's not that different. So first thing we want to do, are we passing along the output? Yes, we are. So that is right. So let's step through and see what's happening. So here is the problem. We're not switching by the output, we're switching by the command. And actually, let me back up here. We're not actually in the part of the statement yet. Let's skip ahead to this part and notice that we never hit this breakpoint. This means that we're hitting some sort of error along the way. So let's see what is going on. So first, making sure that this is right, we are trying to get the node foo in the first vault. But we are not able to, and something is going wrong in this part. So let's do this. Can add a try and a catch here, just for the purposes of debugging to figure out what is going on. And let's restart the debugger. Okay, so now that we're here, let's click play And note that it exited, but we also haven't hit the debugger. So there's something else going on right now. So let's go fetch this again and actually step through these functions and see what's going on. So once, depending on what function you step into, and especially if it's an async function, it might get a little messy in terms of the parts that it'll actually step through. And so it looks like it's during this API call that we are getting an issue. So get node by path, we can actually go something that I like to do when I'm working on code is I like to have the main logic on the top screen and then secondary logic on the bottom pane. This is because debugging this engine client right now is a side issue, and after I fix it, I can close everything in the second pane. So this get engine by path is just making an API call, but for some reason it is not returning. And in this case, what we're gonna do, we're gonna remove this try catch from here, format, and add another try catch here. Now the reason we actually have to put in a debugger statement instead of being able to set a breakpoint is because of the nature that the test code here is in a different package than the code that is doing the testing. It might be possible that you can set up the source maps and a VSCode configuration that will make this actually work with a breakpoint instead of actually having to write in debugger, but it wasn't worth the effort to try to figure out how to do that, and this has been working. So this is why we are using actually writing in a debugger statement in the source code. Okay, so it hits the first debugger point, it hits a second debugger point, and it is still erroring out. All right, at this point, let's see what is going on.
Sorry, I'm only partially paying attention.
Oh,
Did
yeah.
API test compile properly?
Let's take a look. Yeah, so everything is good according to the watcher. There are no type errors. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I wasn't sure of API.ts because it has a red squiggly.
Ah, I see. The reason it has a red doodly is because I added a try catch here, and so it now might no longer fulfill this type contract. But that's okay for us right now because we'll be removing this try catch statement. Something else to notice is that because we've been doing the debug, it started the debug point with this JavaScript file. I usually like to keep all the debugging windows in one place so it just doesn't pollute my code. So when I hit debug, the top right section I reserve for tests. Okay, so now we're here, we're in Dendron. So we're making a request. And then this is when everything dies. So let's figure out what is going on. One thing we can do to sidestep this issue is when you run the CLI, the way that we're creating an engine right now, it says create engine from server. And what this means is when Dendron starts locally, when you run Dendron inside VS Code, what actually happens is we instantiate a local server, and then the Dendron plugin communicates with the server to create nodes, look up nodes, and do everything of that sort. The reason we have this client-server model is because we, in the past, we had multiple applications working with the server. So your preview was a different extension than your graphs, which was a different extension than Dendron. We've since consolidated everything into Dendron, but the reason it's shown as server is because, one, the server runs in a separate process. So whenever Dendron is indexing your nodes or looking stuff up, it doesn't interfere with you using VS Code. And then two, like in the future, we'll also be adding additional clients. So you can imagine, for example, a Chrome extension or a different IDE or even Vim interacting with the Dendron server. For the focuses of this demo, or for this walkthrough, I'm just going to, instead of creating an engine from the server, we're just going to spin up an engine locally so it's easier for us to actually debug what is going on. And so by getting rid of that line, essentially what I've done is now the CLI, instead of spinning up a server, it is actually just going to instantiate an instance of the Dendron engine and connect to it like that. Okay, and so we can see that the data is undefined, or it is not. So in this case, we actually got the node back. And we are able to serialize it and update it. So this means if we try to run this again normally, I've turned off the watcher, so let me turn this back on. We'll notice that for the snapshot, it is actually still not updated. So there's one more thing that's going on. So let's inspect. We've made a bunch of changes at this point, and some of it has been actually modifying the source. And so an easy way of just seeing, of trying to figure out what I need to revert, I can look in the source control panel and see what I've changed. For this stuff, I don't want to keep anything here. It was just debugging, so let's just discard everything. For the notes, all this code is good, it's valid. I have a debugger statement right now that I'll get rid of, but everything else is good. I'm just going to stage this. Similarly, for the spec file, I'm going to save that. And then it looks like I created a new note in this process. I'm going to get rid of that. Right. So now that I've cleaned up my changes, notice that whenever I open up change, it opens up a new diff window. I'm just going to close all that. And now to see what is actually going on right now, the problem is we're printing the payload, but we're returning the data. And so the data is actually just JSON. And so this is why this test isn't working, is because we are returning the result. And this is something to take note of, is like when we're writing these functions, it's not just the effect that we want to have, which in this case it's printing it out to standard out. but also making sure these components are testable. And right now, the main behavior of lookup, which is outputting the notes in a certain format, is printed, which isn't actually easy to test. So I would say this function isn't actually complete because we don't have a good way of quickly testing it. And so let's actually modify this data output. So right now, we've kind of taken the lazy way. We're saying that this CLI command can give any output. Ideally, this should be typed. It will be typed. But what it means right now is that we can modify this without having the compiler complain. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to return the payload. And usually for responses, I like to return a tuple, either if it's errored and if it hasn't errored, the actual data that the command gives back. So this command, I'm going to have it return a payload, and then what was the data from getNodePath, I'm just going to return that as a raw response. And now I'm going to update this test. So we're getting data, and what we expect is the data payload. Let's see, what is going on? Data. Oh, so the reason this is Typescript isn't letting me autocomplete is because the run command can either return this object or a string. And so this is messing a little bit, going into the types again. So according to this, we return two things from the execute command. It's the engine delete node payload, and then it's this new payload that we just typed in. So let's actually go ahead and describe the output instead of any. So normally this is what we return for most engine commands. Is data is anything that is the actual payload of what the command is executing, and an error if something has errored out. So let's make sure that the delete conforms to this, and now we should be able Okay, so this is just a TypeScript compiler being very particular. It knows that we can return either from the delete command or the lookup command, and the delete command does not have a payload. There's multiple ways of addressing this. Right now, I'm just going to have the delete command have the same signature as the lookup command. And so now, if we take a look at this test, it has gone, it's updated the snapshot, and you'll notice the snapshot is no longer JSON, but the body. One more thing to do here is, usually the snapshot test, it's useful, it's a quick way of seeing what the output is, but you actually do want to do something a little bit more solid to make sure that you're actually looking to make sure that the behavior you're testing for is actually there. Snapshot is just a lazy way of capturing everything. And so in this case, I actually want to make sure this note, like none of these attributes are going to change. So just to make sure that nothing funny happens, I'm actually also going to just check for the string. So we actually have a helper function for that. Check string, it takes a body, and then things that you want to match in that body. So in this case, it's going to be this. Oh, and this is an async function, so it needs to be awaited. But check string, it actually has an expect matcher already in it, so we don't need to run expect on it. And now if we run this, we'll notice that this test passes. We now need to do some fixing because we did change the type signature here. So let's see what happens when we run the whole test suite. So we have a couple of errors now because the format isn't the same. So let's look at what's going on. So for the first one, with no vaults specified, let's isolate this to just this test. It looks like we got into the insert unreachable area. So over here, it means that we haven't given a default output. The reason for this is because the CLI, when you run it via the CLI, it will supply this output as a default. But because we're running this programmatically, we're not actually taking this into account. So we actually do need to supply the default outputs. And I believe there's one more place where we need to do that. So the second one is, yeah, down here. Okay. And so at this point, what I would do is go back in Dendron. So we've wrote some tests. We make sure that Dendron Markdown is good. And then the next one would be making sure that we could also output in regular Markdown, or not regular Markdown, but GitHub flavored Markdown. When this is complete, we would submit our PR and then go through the PR process, which is documented in our dev site. But I'm not going to, since we're at time, I'm not going to go through implementing the GitHub flavored Markdown, but it'll be along the same lines of what we were doing just here. The last thing I'll do before wrapping up is just reviewing the changes I made. So in this case, making sure I remove the debuggers, that everything that is changed is what I would expect. And then at this point, I would leave a message. So Okay. Let's see if there's anything else that I was going to cover. No, so that's basically all for this talk. So what we did, we created a Scratch node, we wrote out what exactly we wanted to accomplish. We started off writing a test, making sure all current tests pass, and then just iterating on working on the node CLI command until the new test passed. In the middle, we ran into an issue with the engine server not returning the right result. We went into a bunch of ways of debugging that. I'll have a follow-up after this to what the actual issue was, so that we won't be kept in suspense. And then we've gone through a bunch of Typescript related checks and best practices. That is all for what I was gonna cover this morning. So at this point, are there any questions?
None for me, but this has been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, the talks will be recorded. Well, it is recorded, and I'll be uploading this to YouTube with any follow-ups. And then I'll also have a link to the settings that I was showing earlier as well. Okay, and that's all. Thank you all for coming to this greenhouse, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everyone.